we need to have trust to do this work. How do you build trust if you don't build trust? And we need to have shared structures and strategies. Just like our students benefit when they walk into a classroom and they're clear about the routines and the structures and the strategies and the purposes of those, as adults we need the same. Next slide, please. When we talk about meaning making and how we foster transformative reflection and discourse, this is the third phase. We're talking about schools need to be places. We can't assume teachers are coming having already done this work, and we can't assume, if I have been doing this work, that it's not needed to happen continuously and in my new community. And so when we talk about this, we're talking about individual reflection and we need times. So here, let me just say it like this. I sometimes need to do work on my own. All my growth isn't dependent on somebody else walking me through it. Sometimes I need to do work when we're talking about cultural competency in affinity. And again, we prioritize talking about race because the greatest demographic predictor of success in America is race. We know there are other variables. We are willing to talk about those, but we always start with race. So, having said that, as a white guy working in a school, if I'm trying to figure out what work do I need to do to close the racial achievement gap, part of my work has to be in affinity. Meaning I need to be sitting with white people talking about this. People of color need to be sitting together talking about this. For very different reasons. I know when we talk about race, part of it is that being on the oppressor side, I need to say some stuff to figure out that I might be sloppy about that would keep me from doing that work in public, and also, quite frankly, that my colleagues of color just don't need to hear again. And my colleagues of color, they need to be together because sometimes what they need is a place for healing. When they see it's their children who are being pushed out at ridiculous rates. I'm sorry, I'm going back to the slide Thomas presented. I really appreciated his courage to say, tremendous progress overall. The gap still exists. Did we see the gap? This screen is not that great. We didn't need it to be a great screen. I was sharing the day that Richard first presented that, Richard Carranza, our superintendent, I described it as perverse. How could I be a teacher of color in this district and that not have some impact on me that, quite frankly, prior to us of doing this work, is going to give me the courage to say what I really need to say in a group that might not be fully representative of my students. So sometimes I need to be there just with my people of color. And sometimes that work and that meaning making has to happen across difference. So at your sites, how much of that is institutionalized for people to do extensive and intentional reflection on their own, in affinity and across difference, specifically around developing your cultural competence? Next slide. We're going to keep going. And then finally, when we talk about the new actions, it's important to know that, again, there's conditions needed for this as well. And when we talk about the conditions, we need resources of time, we need leadership. Leaders have to be at least one step ahead of the game. Leaders, we need to actually be with other leaders doing this work so that when we're leading it in our schools, we are at least one step ahead for when our staff or our community or our students hit an obstacle. We need permission. I mentioned this earlier. We're asking people to do things that we traditionally haven't done. We're asking people to take risk. We need a culture where not only failure, not failure for the sake of failure is acceptable. We're not saying you can just go and blow it out of the water for the sake of carelessness, but failure towards the impact of change needs to be accepted with a different, with a different welcome. In your school communities, how is failure experienced by the adults, by the students. And finally, we need increased accountability. And I'm not talking about the increased accountability of standardized tests. I'm talking about the accountability that comes with autonomy. If I, as a professional, need to be able to step out of the box and try things differently, I need systems to be able to come back and say, did that actually work? And if it didn't work, what do I do in response to it? Okay, next slide. So when we talk about transforming to cultural competency, it's important to know that culturally competent educators, these are the individuals, or culturally competent schools, systemically, constantly develop awareness and knowledge. This is that first piece, that first phase of transformation. It is a constant journey of developing awareness and knowledge of others' cultures, and then specifically provide instruction, support, and intervention that reflect, respect, and respond to their specific students. This presentation is not intended to make you all culturally competent. It's intended to get people, because there's people in this room who know this, but it's intended to formulate conversation at your tables, calibration around what this looks like at your site. I also want to talk about this urgency around equity. The district has equity as a very primary focus of its work, and yet I think it's important to say that equity is neither a current initiative nor our next strategic effort. That we've got to stop thinking about equity as the add-on, as one of many things in our list. Equity is the lens through which we must look at and prioritize any initiative, any focused effort. And so part of the reason they're bringing in SFSUS to start the day is to actually keep raising the equity lens for the work that you're going to be doing. So when we're done, the hope is that when you move into your RTI conversations, you're going to get a lot of information. How are you using your equity lens to do your RTI work in the context of your school, specifically for the students that are least reached in your community? So just real quickly, we're not going to actually do this. I just want to do another show of hands. How many people have seen this? Great. I just think it's important for a school to be very clear about what it means by equity. The good news is our district this year has adopted a definition of equity, which is fantastic. The question is, are you calibrated around what that definition is? So when we're talking about equity, are we clear about what that means? As recently as the past couple months, I had an adult come up to me and say, I got an equity issue for you. That was a good start. All right, which equity issue? I've been at my school 20-something years. They forced me to move my room this year. And I thought, to you, that actually is an equity issue. But that's not the definition of equity we're talking about in SFUSD. So it's just important to ask yourself, have you had that conversation as a school? Next slide, please. We can skip over this. So we're about to break into some conversation at our table, all right? And I'm going to ask you to take out this letter to the district. How many people, and again, I know some people have seen this before, but this is an effort to get as many people on the same page as possible. How many people have read this text before? Show of hands. Okay, maybe about 20%. All right, good. So this text, just to give some history for the rest of y'all, this came last year in preparing for the Administrators Institute. The district came to the data again to say, guess what? We're not serving our African American students nearly as well as our other students. Yeah, nobody really flinched when they heard that. They were like, right, we know that. And specifically the male African American students, even worse. Nobody flinched. Well, we need to make a presentation to the administrators and make it clear that this is our priority. And I pushed back and said, I don't think anybody does not believe it's the priority. Where I question is how many people understand what that means or understand what they feel about it. And so as a result, I was asked to create this document. Let me tell you how it was done. So we worked with one of the continuation schools so that we could get a cross range of students who came from a variety of schools, East Side, West Side, etc. And we specifically said we wanted to work with African American students who are on the cusp. And so on the cusp means that they've not yet been pushed out of public schools, but their experiences have them close enough where they may make it, they may not make it. And so we did a focus group, and at the end of the focus group we transcribed everything that the students said and then went through the transcription and mashed their language so that everything you see on here, with the exception of just some syntax changes, is actual direct quotes. But we mashed direct quotes so we can come from one voice of a fictional student. So they're real quotes from all these students, but one voice, as if one student were writing a letter to the district in response to this issue the district has identified as a high priority of not serving African American students. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you to read this. Could we go to the next one, please? I'm going to ask you to read this, and as you're reading it, please highlight 2 to 3 phrases or sentences that resonate in some way for you. That's it. Yeah, no, we're good. And I'm going to give us I'll check in about 7 minutes and see where we're at. And then what we're going to do is we're going to break into trios, including if you have to move to the next table to make a trio. And we're going to have a structured conversation about that. All right? So I'll check in about 7.